Well, I'd say this. Look, if everybody was like you, we probably would not have any problems. I very much enjoyed talking to you, and it was very cool to hear someone who brings interesting insights and makes me think about stuff and go, hey, you know what? Am I able to defend this or this idea in a long form style? And it's very valuable.
Welcome to the N1 Experience, brought to you by N1 Education, the leader in fitness education.
Welcome back to the N1 Experience. Today I am talking to Matt Garbarino, and he is more prominent on TikTok and in the younger age. So another one from that side of the spectrum of the science-based community. I look forward to talking to him about how he landed there and what his experience has been like and some of the content that he has been making. Welcome, Matt. Why don't you give us a quick intro of who you are and the origin story of how you ended up in this scientific-based niche on social media?
So it's actually kind of interesting because when I first started making content, I actually never saw myself in like a science community or whatever. That was never something when I originally started that I actually wanted to sort of be in. But it's something that sort of happened over time as people resonated with certain videos and me talking about splits and certain things to where it's almost like you become known for something, even if that's not your original intention. So my whole fitness kind of experience didn't start till I was 19. I'm 22 now. I had zero physical training experience of any kind. When I was like 15, I was a little shorter than now. So I was like 5'5", 175, like no muscle at all. I mean, just total skinny fat, fluffiness, not at all what I wanted. Probably around, say, 18, I just totally like cut, like no, not a good cut either. I mean, just totally, skinny fat cut, whatever, down to like 129. And I was a little taller. So I was like 5'7", 129. And that's pretty much where I started from. So it was totally from nothing, zero physical culture, physical experience, no sports, nothing. And I said, hey, you know what? I'm here right now. I'm going to try to just maximize my circumstances best I can. And that's pretty much where I'm at today. So it was kind of just a long process of just figuring things out kind of for myself. I have no formal education in fitness or whatever. This has all been just self-taught, self-discovery, self-experience.
Now, when you say self-taught, describe to me what that means.
That experience really has been from when I first started TikTok, like 2021. That was kind of, again, where I'm like, okay, I'm like 18 years old. I have this like skinny fat physique at 129 pounds. What do I do? And then you start kind of learning how to like assess information for yourself. And obviously some people will be more right than others or whatever. But when I first started, it was really just listening to some of the staples, the JPG, Ryan Jewers, whatever else, some of the staple kind of guys. And I'm like, wow, this makes sense. Like this speaks to me. And obviously, when you're that age, whatever, I didn't have the beard or anything. So I'm walking around the gym and you got like the older guys in the gym that are like, oh, bro, you got to do this. Arnold said to do that. And it's like, okay, yeah, but is there any real, basis for what you're saying? Or are you just using the appeal of another person to make this argument to me? So I heard both arguments and I was like, you know what? I actually do kind of resonate with what some of these younger guys are saying. People, under 30, whatever, who seem to have really immersed themselves in this. And obviously, there are tons of people out there way, way smarter than me or whatever that have kinesiology degrees and stuff where I'm like, wow, this speaks to me. So I found that very interesting. And that's kind of what led me down the rabbit hole a little bit. Maybe too far at times, but that's what started it.
So in terms of the information that you've found online from your selected influencers, have you chose to dig into any of that information on your own? Or are you pretty much finding like, okay, these are people that I kind of trust and I'm going to let them disseminate that information and I'm going to take it at face value?
So when I first started, I would coach people for free because obviously it's okay, you're just starting. Now you have to, people locally, people at the local gym, friends of friends, whatever, they're here, they're saying, oh, Matt, you seem to have really taken an interest in this. How can you help me out to an extent? So when I'm first starting, obviously my credentials or whatever were not at the level where I wanted them to be. So I'm like, let's help some people for free. So I was kind of like watch them grow, watch them develop, seeing what kind of works for them. And contrary to what a lot of these science guys are saying, I very much understand that things are not one size fits all. There are a lot of contexts where something that might be optimal or right on paper might in execution not actually be, the best or most optimal approach. So I feel like it's a mix of both where it's like, okay, yeah, if someone who I watch on TikTok who routinely cites good sources, and I look through it and I'm like, okay, what these guys are saying generally for the most part seems to check out. You could take what they're saying as a nice baseline, but then you actually have to go and apply it yourself and go, hey, wait a minute, does this actually check out for me personally or for some other people?
In terms of the people citing sources and stuff, do you ever chase down the sources. So if somebody says, hey, this study says this, or if there's an infographic, do you take the effort to like, hey, I'm going to go read this myself and see what I think?
Sure. I mean, a very common one, for example, is like the reps in reserve versus failure, like, okay, your stimulus versus your fatigue or whatever. I mean, I've dove down some rabbit holes on some of these. And at the end of the day, when you have one study or whatever, it can be useful for guiding you in a direction. But then, especially if it hasn't been replicated like a whole number of times, it's like, well, why hasn't this been replicated? Right. So you'll have certain studies that come out, and then it's like, well, wait a minute. Then you'll have like, 3, 4, 5, 6 other studies that point in another direction. So I do try to dig down, rabbit holes or whatever. It's funny. I actually talked to a guy I'm actually working with that I coach in person. He's actually working on his own meta-analysis. He's actually going to become a doctor. And I was talking to him about what it's actually like to dig through some of these sources. And it's hairy, like it gets pretty hairy sometimes. So I definitely like to talk to people who are able to really like dig through and go, well, wait a minute, this study's a little outdated, or this study, the conditions for this study were not great. Or, I remember a while ago, you had like that 52 sets per week study or whatever that came out. And people were like, yeah, well, was that volume even really appropriate to run a study anyway? And I'm like, it's pretty interesting. Yeah. So I like to try to chase the rabbit holes when I can, but ultimately I feel like there are some limitations practically when a study comes out anyway.
Yeah. On a lot of these topics, the amount of time and effort it takes to thoroughly investigate that topic is a lot. And depending on how far you go, especially with mechanistic stuff and whatever, the papers can get very difficult to read and interpret. A lot of people know me for biomechanics, but there is a degree of mathematical computing and stuff that's done in some of these models where I'm just like, okay, that's just a whole bunch of symbols. So I always find it interesting what people's approach is to try and have their best take on the evidence, because it's so common on social media for a piece of cherry picked or selected or a piece of information or a quote in isolation to get presented, and then that thing go viral and spread throughout. Just a few weeks ago, I pointed out that example where basically an EMG graph for a lateral raise and a shoulder press was shown. And that was just one piece of the evidence, and it was not representative of the evidence as a whole, which doesn't take to type in deltoid EMG is not a lot of work, and then just find a few of the other papers. But it was very interesting to kind of look at that as a case study for how many people just picked that up, regurgitated the message with zero effort to look for any additional evidence or really look at how relevant that graph was to the question of, are shoulder presses and lateral raises essentially interchangeable for the middle delt?
And from what I understand, EMG data is not even like the most reliable thing anyway. No, like at certain times where it's not.
Without getting super specific in EMG, let's just say that for the most part, all of our data has limitations. So if we're looking at muscle thickness in an applied study, that has limitations. So EMG also has limitations. So these things have varying degrees of limitations. So you have to understand when those limitations are a bigger factor and when they're not, versus I don't like to just be like, well, EMG has limitations, but it also is a relative decent proxy, or maybe the only evidence we have in certain things. And so we have to understand like, okay, how much confidence or value can we put in this, and not just be like, well, okay, a limitation exists, therefore what? And you'll see that a lot of people will be like, well, okay, when an EMG study supports their bias, cool, look at this study that supports my bias. When it doesn't, oh, well, it's EMG, so
it doesn't
useless.
Count. Yeah, they do that.
And you see that happen a lot with all sorts of topics. It happens with this swelling topic as well. People are like, oh, this hypertrophy study, agreed with what I thought, and then this one doesn't.
A great study. Yeah, and then when they don't like it, it's like, oh, it's just edema.
And the irony is edema is not even the appropriate term for that type of swelling. Well, and I know a few people, because that topic kind of became an issue in certain circles, are actually doing some work to validate that. They're running a replication on one of the volume studies, and then on the back end of that, they're going to measure at different time courses to also investigate how much swelling there is, or whether or not it's affecting the relative results. So they're both going to look at, can we replicate the results of the volume study, but also what effects, if any, are there from a swelling perspective at different time courses of measurement after the fact. So that should be
It's really cool.
really nice
Exciting.
when that's done. So sounds like you got into the science-based space by simply the people that you found interesting and chose to follow your influence, right? So when did you start adding that label or brand to some of your content or your methodology?
It's interesting because it's almost like certain things find you, right? So a fun thing that people don't sort of realize about this industry is that the most profitable aspect of it by far is fat loss. Like fat loss by far for coaches in general, it's probably the easiest thing to do because it's pretty straightforward. I mean, it's not easy for the clients to do it. It's easy for you to guide people because it doesn't really change all that much. But then in training, it's like, wait a minute, every 3 to 6 months, like certain widely agreed upon things do shift. And I think that's cool because that's, science or whatever. But what happens is whenever something like that does happen, I'll report on it in the video. And if we were like, oh shit, this guy Matt's talking about, this new study, whatever. I remember like a big one that kind of got me, and that was one of the recovery studies that came out like a year or two ago. And it basically said that legs recover faster or whatever. And it was, I forget what the training volumes looked like, but it's pretty interesting. So I made a video about it. I'm like, oh yeah, it looks like based on this one study, I'm not saying it's official, but based on this study, that legs actually recovered faster than chest, and the chest is one of the slower recovering muscles. So little things like that. I'll make a video reporting on it, and then people seem to attach the label to me. I made a video about the upper lower split back, I think in October of last year, when that was sort of being widely popularized. I'm like, hey, this frequency thing is pretty cool. It looks like, for the same reason you don't train a muscle once a month or once a year or whatever, you also might not want to train a muscle once a week, at least for most people, given that it looks like 2 or 3 times a week frequency looks to be performing better. So that kind of thing like sort of got people going like, oh, Matt's the upper lower split guy, right? So then I got a few thousand people on my email list because I made a video giving away a free upper lower split. So that kind of thing brought all those people to me. And now that I'm in the science-based industry or whatever, that's the label that's been attached.
Now, I think one of the biggest disagreements is whether or not the science-based community on TikTok actually fits the definition of science-based. So I'm curious if you have a definition or what you think actually qualifies somebody as being science-based.
So I feel like the number one factor obviously has to be willingness to actually change and listen to other opinions. So if I watch a video from 2021, and it can be from someone incredible, it can be from a very good source, be TNF, JPG, Ryan Jewers, whoever is widely seen as like a pretty good source. If that video from 2021 looks exactly the same as, a video from 2025, that would raise an alarm. It's like, wait a minute, like you didn't change any opinion in 4 years, whatever, right? So things do like improve. And what happens, and I think this is probably the biggest disqualifier of being science-based or whatever, is marrying yourself to like one school of thought and then never abandoning that. And it's not, it's not an attack on anyone, obviously, but when people stretch median hypertrophy, whatever, right? People that join like the stretch cult or whatever, they've like decided, just like permanently decided that like, oh, every muscle needs to be trained in like a super deep stretch. They've permanently made that decision. So then once like good research comes out, that's like, oh, well, wait a minute, maybe, this muscle might not benefit from stretch mediated hypertrophy, or maybe this muscle, you might want to work in a length, but maybe not for the same reason as, you might train the biceps at length for a different reason than you might train the hamstrings at length or whatever, right? Or maybe, triceps. Oh, hey, this study on shortened partials actually showed triceps grew pretty well from being trained in the shortened position, whatever. Once people decide that they've like married the school of thought, then they never can abandon it. So I feel like that's the biggest red flag for actually being science-based, is when you pick one aspect of the industry and you're like, oh, I'm there. Yeah. And then you never end up leaving it. So for me, at least, I feel like your willingness to change, to listen to what other people have to say, hey, this guy makes some good points, but, I don't know if I'm fully sold yet. Or just having the humility to say, hey, I actually don't know. Like, hey, I'm not actually well-versed on this enough to give you an opinion. I feel like that actually can put you in that category as having the wisdom to sort of agree with that,
Okay. Interesting. Not the definition that I would use, but an interesting one. I did an episode with Eric Helms, I think it was like my first or second episode, and we discussed this and we kind of laid out the difference between evidence-based and science-based.
How do you see it?
I look at it as more so that you're actually applying the evidence and a scientific method to your training practice. Evidence-based literally means you're considering all of the evidence. That includes research, that includes clinical observation, anecdote, the whole gamut. Like a lot of people tend to say, okay, evidence-based is research-based, and that's not true. And the same thing, science-based isn't just, okay, whatever the study says, it's actually applying the scientific method where it's like, okay, we have a hypothesis, we're going to, based off of the current evidence, we're going to apply that, see how that works, right? And then try and draw some conclusions and repeat that process over and over and over again. And that's essentially what the bro version of bodybuilding has been for the, we'll say, the intellectual bros, like the people that they track their weights and take records of what they do. Yeah, there's some people that just every session they just go in and they wing it, so they have no real ability to know how things are working very well, et cetera, because there's no data. But there's also a good portion of what most people would consider pure bros that are actually, in my opinion, taking a more scientific approach to their training because they're just meticulous in tracking their data and looking at it and being consistent and then being able to say, okay, I did this. Here were the variables involved. My body responded this way. I changed this variable, this. Obviously, an N of one experience has all of the confounding variables of your life, your stress, your sleep, your work, everything. But it's also the most contextual to you versus another study where it's like, okay, these people have different genetics, different environments, et cetera. So to me, a scientific approach is like you use the evidence you have, you apply the scientific method to an N of one, and you just repeat that process.
I like the sound of it.
And so how much you change or don't change would just be relative to what the data goes with, right? And I think that's the reason I think that hanging on the research can be misleading because we have huge recency bias. We tend to think the most important thing is just the last thing that was a hot topic. And I don't think people realize how many of these things are cyclical, like the volume topic and the frequency. This isn't the first time that this trend has cycled through, right? Me growing up, the first time around, it was called HST or hypertrophy specific training. 3 times a week, fairly low volume, and a lot of similarities. I think the only real separation between that and now is the rep range thing. But this is not a new thing. These things just go in these cycles, and it just depends on the messaging that's being out there.
I remember Steve Reeves, in like the 50s, was talking about full body, like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or whatever. This been going around for a very long time,
Yep. I think you should be open to change, but I don't think a qualification for being science-based is that you should change. Because I think in a lot of cases, if you're actually being like evidence-based, you should be somewhat resistant to some of the drastic changes that the industry does, because it just tends to be trendy in a degree or magnitude that isn't really relevant to the research as a whole. Okay, here's this one study that came out. So the stretch or lengthened bias stuff is an example. Like a lot of people took that too far, right? Also, there's a whole group of people that were overly resistant for, we'll say, not very actual scientific reasons, but contrarian just to be contrarian. And then you had misinterpretation of the research on both sides. I'm not sure what study you were referencing when you talked about the triceps and the partial, but if it was like the Goto study where they did like the mid-range partial.
Came out, I don't remember the actual name of it, but it came out like a few months ago. I don't remember like the exact specifics, but it was showing that like they did some shortened range and I think it was like they were 44% more or something. But again, that was one study. It could have been, I'm sure there could have been some limitations. I'd have to dig further. But
yeah, if it came out just a few months ago, then I don't recall saying that one. So it's interesting.
I guess the way you could say it is trust but verify, right? Like being a little resistant to every time there's a new trend. Okay, I'm not going to like trend hop, but if it fits your if it scientifically makes sense and you can look through the evidence and say, okay, hey, you know what? This seems to check out. You get some personal experience in there. I feel like that's a valid, thing to qualify you as science-based.
So let's roll this into the topic of, you've made a post, and I think you've said this across several of them, that basically teenagers today know more about building muscle than bodybuilders 40 years ago. Explain to me what that means.
So it's funny. I feel like that one is probably pretty obvious, but a lot of people on Instagram or whatever are like, oh my God, how could you say it? It almost stems from this thing where like once someone has achieved like a very, very high level physique and has, been Mr. Olympia on the Mr. Olympia stage, whatever, it almost makes them impervious to all kinds of criticism or even revision of their methods. And I think that's, in a sense, a shame, because a lot of these guys were very impressive and did things in absence of the research that we have available today. So it's not taking anything away from them, at least to me, to say, hey, look, like these guys were just going in raw in like 1985, had access to pretty much nothing that we have available to now, and actually ended up being pretty right on a lot of things. However, with that said, when you look at how well educated the average younger person is just on certain very basic things that were not even thought of years ago. I mean, up until even the 90s, you've got people talking about like micro tears to build muscle. Carbs are for fatties. I mean, I heard clips from IFBB pros, whatever, 30 years ago. Oh yeah, we didn't eat carbs. Carbs were for fatties. I mean, that's literally the level of information people had access to back then. So when I talk to people, like people even come up to me in the gym sometimes, whatever, that recognize me or whatever, for the most part, it's people that are somewhat within the realm of reasonability. I mean, maybe they don't do the exact same volume that I do. They don't do the exact same rep ranges that are seen as 100% perfect or whatever, but they do seem to be sort of in the right ballpark. They understand that, each set to a degree has diminishing returns. There is a point where you'll do a certain amount of sets in the workout, and it's like, all right, I've kind of reached my diminishing return point. I'm kind of going to cut it here because there's no real point in me going on doing 40, 50, 60 sets of workouts. So if you actually, I think if most people actually looked at the training program of the average Mr. Olympia from 1980 or 1975, whatever, if they actually looked at what they were doing and you took all their programs and read them all out, I think the majority of them by today's standards would probably look terrible. And that's just kind of the way it is. I mean, they didn't really have access to much back then. So the way I see it is that because of just the fortune of being born a lot later that myself and a lot of other people have, and I'm 22, I'm born in 2003. A lot of these kids are born in 2005, 2006. What they have access to is stuff that nobody had access to back then. So I feel like that's just something that changes with time.
So I believe there's a partial truth to that, because yes, the evidence that we have now is better than 40 years ago. But also there's a difference between us understanding mechanisms, knowing why things happen, and knowing so basically like application versus just understanding the mechanism of why. So if we look at, okay, bodybuilders 40 years ago, and we actually look at what were they applying in the gym. So for instance, you'll mention the carbs are for fatties thing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we had the insulin thing that was actually born from research, right? Of insulin's what makes you fat and stuff like that. It was not like a pure bro thing. But if you look at how they actually took and applied that stuff, a lot of things that they applied would fit the standards of being quote unquote science-based in terms of volume, progressive overload, intensity and effort, etc. Mm-hmm. The understanding or okay, here's why I think this works. The change in that doesn't actually change the fact that, well, if we're doing the same thing, but the difference between 40 years ago and now is just that you're more correct in understanding why it works versus we have the same understanding of what works. So
I think Mike Benz is a great example of that, right? Because if you look at his training, it was pretty good. I mean, maybe he didn't know exactly why, like you just said, but he's doing a lot of the same things.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to agree or disagree with how good Mike Mentzer's training was. You look at Arnold, who had very contrasting thing, because a lot of times I think what gets lost is a lot of people think that we can come up with one way to end up with the stimulus equation. And in reality, we have interchangeable variables. And then we also have individual difference in response to those. So it doesn't matter. You want to talk about frequency, you want to talk about volume, all of these things, there's going to be a degree of variance, and you can leverage these things differently. So anybody that's coached for a long time, especially if you've coached a wide spectrum of athletes, like from just regular everyday people looking for fat loss to people that are elite athletes, especially when you get into also working with genetically elite and enhanced athletes and stuff. It's a big spectrum. And within those, there's still variation. Is you understand, we can look at the research and it gives us a very limited view of how frequency worked under these specific conditions in this specific population. In the real world, I'm organizing training and volume for this specific person. And there's not going to be a magic frequency that works for everybody. We might eventually accumulate enough data that we can create a rough bell curve, right? But that's not, to me, a scientific approach, because you still then have to apply that to the N1. And for every bell curve, there are people that are on the sides of the bell and even outside the bell curve, right? There just happens to be more in the middle. And we're looking at these things in terms of the bell curves. If we're looking at research, you could run a study and it was terrible for half the people and great for the other half. But what would the mean be, right? And actually what this was is, for these people, it was bad. For these people, it was exceptionally good. What if we report the mean, we report it doesn't matter. And in reality, it mattered for both. It just mattered for people differently. And a lot of times that context isn't presented in the research, or if it is, like, those levels of nuances are just overlooked. So you look at guys that were going for volume, right? What percentage of people do you think chose a training strategy, saw no results, and then just doubled down and kept doing it? I don't think you're probably going to find a lot of evidence that people found a strategy that wasn't yielding results and then just hedged their bets on, I'm just going to do this forever, right? I think if you look at most of the people, and keep in mind, bodybuilding was a fringe thing. So you have a small population of people doing this. Now we have orders of magnitude larger of people getting into this, and they're getting into it much earlier, right? So when we look at physiques back then, like, those people might not have started this until they were in their late 20s or 30s, versus now we see people that started this pre-puberty. And then we look at this, and so it's not necessarily reasonable to compare people that started this like on when they were over the hill in terms of their prime for hypertrophy and stuff, and then we're applying this, and now we have so many of these people that basically have been doing this since they were teenagers. So I think you'll probably find that when we look at actual application and what works, there isn't going to be that much separation between the people that were actually applying a scientific method 50 years ago and the ones today. But there might be a different understanding in mechanisms. And 20, 30 years from now, the understanding of mechanisms will be different than it is today. So you might be as equally wrong today about why the things you're doing work as the people were then, respectively. And I don't think it's fair to say that, like, a teenager now, if you compare the relative information that's out there and their understanding of it compared to back then, I would say the comprehension on average was actually probably better relative to what was available, partly because now it is significantly harder to navigate the mass amount of information. So now there's so much more, and the unfortunate state is there's a higher volume of not very accurate information. Nuance dies on social media. So the simplest, most watered down version, the most extreme, absolute claims, that's the stuff that gets the most attention. And so now I think, even though people have access to the most information, there's almost a barrier to finding the good information, because it's just going to get buried by the algorithm, which disincentivizes people to actually learn more and present stuff in a more nuanced way. I know this.
I agree.
I see it in my engagement all the time. Instagram allows you to do 20 posts on a slider now. Cool. To me, I'm like, that's amazing.
No one reads. No one gets people, to the end. Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, that's really unfortunate, because somebody can take 45 seconds. They can do a very viral reel, make an absolute claim, throw up a study title, an infographic, or whatever it is, or it's just some computer generated meter bar that moves it, like whatever it is. So many people are going to see that and be like, oh yeah. And for me to pull that apart takes a level of attention that people just aren't going to commit to.
They don't have the attention span for it, period.
Yeah. So I would say that it works there. That works against people now in terms of their relative understanding to the total amount of information. So when if we merge this a little bit with the respect topic, I see something like that. I think that's an ignorant way of looking at it, because I think this is just saying that the evidence now is helping us understand the mechanisms more. but we really haven't in 40 years, have we come up with a secret training method?
No,
No.
no,
How
of
close
course.
to
Yeah.
failure do you need to train? Perfect
Close.
RIR, right?
Yeah, I mean, that could go around forever. And I think, to set the record straight on that, like, once again, when you compare relatively like what people had available back then, I mean, they were in a sense batting 1,000 on certain things. And like you said, nobody took a training style they hated and was like, I'm just going to stick to this. It's getting me no results, but I'm just going to stick to this forever, whatever, right? People were always like switching things around to some extent. So when you look at what people had available back then on certain subjects, which was not very much, I would say the self-discovery aspect and actually obviously living through it, like getting to an Olympia stage or getting to a very high level, those lived experiences are priceless, right? Like most people would say being able to get to 5% body fat doesn't matter, what year you're in. That is a priceless experience for someone. So it's not taking anything away from people 40 years ago or whatever. So when I make a video, and this comes up a lot, I'll make a video about Tom Platz, Arnold Schwarzenegger, whatever it is. People don't really understand that these are interesting topics. These are interesting people. Like if I saw Tom Platz at an event, would I walk up and be like, oh, your training sucked? Like, of course not. And I don't even think his training did suck, obviously. But it's an interesting concept to say, hey, you know what? Someone 40 years ago who lived in absence of a lot of what we have now. Granted, we do have more noise now, but they lived in absence of a lot of what we have now. They did X, Y, and Z, and maybe they trained their arms a certain way and they trained their legs a certain way. Maybe they did a certain frequency or a certain rep range. Why did they do that? They did that instinctively. They didn't even have, like you said, a means of proving or understanding the mechanism. So a lot of these guys did these things instinctively. And it's very interesting to talk about why certain people did these things, what their instinct might have been. So when I talk about it in the video, it ruffles a lot of feathers or whatever. But what people don't understand is that's like what good content is being able to actually analyze a figure that people find interesting or an event or a training style or whatever, and to look through it and say, wow, this happened like forever ago. Why did this happen? And so that's pretty much the simple answer as to, why I say, hey, you know what? A high schooler might know more about certain things than someone did 40 years ago. Well, because they have a lot more resources, a lot more noise, but a lot more resources. So that's kind of the way I see it. It's just making things interesting.
Would you disagree with people 40 years ago had no choice but to take a scientific approach, like applying the scientific method to their training more than today? Because today people feel like they can leverage the research and stuff more to make the decisions for them rather than having to really be meticulous of, okay, I'm going to try a variety of these things. I see more people that will do less self-experimentation because they will trust what other people are saying or what they perceive the research or evidence to be more than they're willing to say, okay, I'm going to try this other thing and I'm going to track things and see how it goes.
I totally agree with that. I mean, when you live in absence of a lot of this influx of information, you're almost forced to go and like run some experimentation on yourself. And granted, maybe some people do that. And I don't know how good the average bodybuilder was in say 1982 at actually assessing their own progress. I don't know if every one of them was tracking progressive overload and whatever. I'm sure some were, I'm sure a lot were probably. So yeah, I mean, I feel like being in the absence of info actually, in a sense, inspires certain people to actually be greater because they have no choice but to sort of run the scientific method on themselves.
How good would you say the top 10, 20% of lifters now are at applying a scientific method and tracking things?
How good are they at applying that?
Would you say that the top 10 or 20% are probably pretty good?
I would say you look at certain people. My favorite example is probably Terrence Ruffin because he seems to bridge this gap between, he does seem to be very evidence-based on certain things, why he does certain things. But when I watch him post about a day he does where he'll do 4 sets sometimes in a day or whatever it is, he'll go, hey, this is, for me, this is for my goals, this is from my experience. So I think you have a lot of people that, I mean, Nick Walker, they all do things differently, but it seems like they have an ability to run this on themselves.
So bodybuilding being more of a fringe thing 40 years ago, those people are more representative of the top people now in terms of their obsessiveness and the relative commitment to it. So I think you can say the partial truth in that I think people now have a greater understanding of mechanisms. We've pushed that story a little further. Doesn't mean we've landed in the correct spot, We're just hopefully more correct than we were, or less wrong on some of these things. But I think in terms of application, back in the day, you had basically a more select group of people that were doing it. They were forced to develop the skill of applying the scientific method to their training. The application that they were using, I would say, if anything, fits or is even better than the population that you're discussing now. Do you think that, and then the other element I would add was just simple gym IQ. So if we take a bodybuilder from 40 years ago and we look at these teenagers today, how many studies can you read and that actually teaches you good technique, how to actually train hard, how to manage your, like, these guys were managing effort and fatigue basically off of instinct, which is a skill you have to develop, which is a more important skill than being able to look at a research paper and having it determine, like, okay, this says I should only do X number of sets. A perfect example of how terrible we'll say the mechanistic research and stuff can be applied is what has been the trends on rep range.
It's gone down. I mean, people are doing 2 rep sets at 1 RAR. I mean, it's gotten kind of crazy on certain things, I'd say.
Yeah. So these are the people. So when you say, hey, the average teenager knows more than the average bodybuilder, in a lot of people's mind, especially because they're going to be exposed to the most viral content, which some of these things are very popular because they're rage bait essentially, or at least that's the response they get. And so they say, okay, so what you're telling me is that these guys that were basically the cream of the crop in terms of actually being obsessive and consistent about this stuff, that were forced to develop all of these skills that a lot of people just never get now because they just trust external sources, and had, we'll say, a significantly better gym IQ because it was also a tight-knit community, right? So you'll see, okay, Arnold's doing cheat reps and stuff, but he's not doing cheat reps in a way that we would actually be like, yeah, actually that probably didn't do anything. It actually is comparable to the results they got in the cheat study, where it's just like, all right, they're essentially just manipulating physics to get some force reps. It's essentially a drop
some extra in there.
You compile all those things, and I don't think that, even given the partial truth that I give you, that scale really fits, that you can say the average teenager now, it knows more about building muscle. I just think there is one specific category where they have an advantage, and in almost every other category, I think it massively flips in the other direction.
No, I respect that. I mean, I respect that take. It's a very valid one. Again, to me, I see it. I will always sort of believe that based on just circumstances of being born, past the year 2000, you are presented with just certain very basic, like fundamental training principles that, again, widely, I mean, we're talking about training the crop, right? Like 80s, people from the 80s or 70s. There were also a lot of people back then who might have not been, quite as meticulous as some people were thinking. So again, it really comes down to the circumstances that the average teenager is born into, the widely accepted principles that are sort of agreed upon, I think will always put them at an advantage. But again, when you talk about grit, willpower, ability to figure certain things out, ability to work on technique, whatever else, those guys win. Well, like the old guys win, period, because there was just less available, so they had to force themselves into that, if that makes sense. So if it wasn't for literally being born 40 years later, I would completely agree with you. But again, I'm sort of halfway there because it's like, circumstantially, I just think the average body of info is just so much better that it's hard to fully say that the average 18-year-old now programs poorly or whatever, because when you actually talk to them, it seems like they have a pretty good grasp on a lot of things. But again, when you talk about grit and willpower and stuff and ability to run the method on yourself, that was unmatched.
Okay. We'll just agree to disagree and move on there.
Of course.
And I think the big thing is just we have very different magnitudes on what we think the evidence that we have in that period of time, what changes to application and the significance that makes. So let's talk about the idea of referencing other bodybuilders in content. So you said basically that you discuss, like the video in Tom Platz, like I'm discussing the professional bodybuilders because people find it interesting. And other people will think that basically this is clout chasing. in a way where it's okay. You're throwing up a famous bodybuilder because you know that's going to grab people's attention, and then you're commenting on that. And I'm curious where you draw your perspective of that people want to hear you do that.
So what it really boils down to is obviously analytics, right? Like how well does a video do? If I do a video and it pretty much ever has to do with Mike Mentzer, Arnold, Tom Platz, someone who's famous, people will listen, period. If I made a video about some obscure bodybuilder, it would not perform as well, end of story. When you're building a business online about sharing your opinions on things, your best goal is to get people to listen to you, to find your page, whatever it is. So what people don't understand is I feel like differentiating entertainment versus respect or giving people credence or whatever. I don't think being an IFBB pro or whatever disqualifies you from analysis. And it's not even saying, oh, I'm superior or whatever. If you're an IFBB pro, you're a Mr. Olympia, whatever. The way I see it is that it does not disqualify you from some basic level of analysis. People have a right to fundamentally, comment on things. So if I talk about something that someone did a very long time ago and I say, hey, look, according to what we know today, it's very interesting to me. And there was a Tom Platz video that really stuck out to me because he said that he never went up more than 30 pounds on dumbbell curls. It's interesting. There's videos of him going heavier that people sent me and they're like, oh, this is interesting. I'm like, yeah. But in his own words, he's like, I never went above 30 pounds. I'm like, well, that's intriguing because relative to his size, it seems pretty light. Then he's talking about legs and you see the way he trained legs and the weights he used. It's like, wait a minute. He's like, I train legs totally differently than arms. And then obviously when you get the genetic factor aside, you look at his physique, you're like, wait a minute, his legs were actually very much his strongest body part. Of course, it's probably genetic in response to, PDs or whatever, but it is still interesting. It's someone who's really famous, a lot of people know, is talking about doing two different types of training on two different body parts. So when it's like, oh, do people want to hear you talk about it? Well, a lot of people seem to, because I get a lot of comments and messages that are like, oh, hey, that was actually really, insightful. I never thought about it that way. Or, oh, I'm going to tell my friend about this. He's a huge Arnold fan. I'm going to share this with him. So it just creates conversation. It's nothing personal. People seem to think it's like some personal vendetta I have against people, and that's not the case. I love a lot of the people I end up talking about, Arnold, Tom, Mike, whoever it is. I think a lot of these guys are super inspiring. It's just being interesting at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Tom Platz trained his legs with really high reps too, like 30s and 50s.
Yeah.
For anybody that doesn't realize that, Tom trained high reps pretty much as his main style of training.
Yeah.
And also, you can never trust a single quote from a bodybuilder or a single workout. Like a lot of people attribute, oh, this is how this person trained. And it's based off of one video or one thing in a magazine, which they may not have even done. Yeah. I think people overestimate how much we can generalize the training of these people, that you're probably going to continue training for, who knows, maybe 20 years, 30, whatever it is. Do you think you're going to do the same training for all that? I hope not, right?
No.
So we have to be very careful with the generalizations. But the thing I'm the most curious on, you're saying you're using the analytics. Do you consider the direction or favorability of those analytics? So if I'm looking at this particular type of content for you, and I can see, yeah, the engagement's significantly higher, but I can also look at the ratio of the likes to comments, and also look at the relative narrative or messaging of those comments. And it seems to be that when you've done this type of content, that a lot of times it's a very, we'll say, a negative biased response. And then if we consider the reaction content to this, you've had more videos go viral at your expense, I think, than you have that you've actually done. And that's where I'm curious. Do you take that into your analysis? Does that kind of let you know how this messaging is being received, or this type of content is being received? And do you think that even though maybe certain analytics move up, this is actually moving your business in a positive direction?
At the end of the day, I don't care at all. To me, I wear it like a badge of honor. If people hate me, fine. You're free to make a video. If you're not a friend, a family member, or someone I love, I don't value your opinion in terms of influencing my life. I could listen to what someone tells me, but ultimately, if you haven't done anything to earn that sort of respect in my personal life, then I really don't care. If I'm getting a bunch of negative comments on Instagram Reels, it's for one of two things. Usually people, I'd say it's probably for one reason. people will fundamentally hate you. And this is something with Instagram that is just, TikTok works completely differently. TikTok it's always positive. It's weird. Instagram works almost completely differently. People will just hate you because they don't feel like you're big enough. End of story. Even though when you explain it to people like, hey, look, you're almost comparing like a heavyweight to a bantamweight. Like, could a heavyweight win? It's like, well, yeah, but are you really saying much? Like when you're comparing me, who's been training a little over 3 years naturally, with someone who's enhanced and has been training for 15, are you really saying much? Like at the end of the day, I don't think you are, because you're comparing two completely different things. Then people genetically have such a giant gap in terms of how they respond to training, period. I mean, you'll see someone who trains for 6 months and looks incredible. So there's so much variance, whether it be genetically, response to PDs, whatever it is, there's so much variance that it's almost impossible, like I said, to use physique or whatever else as a qualification. There are people way smaller than me who I think are way smarter than me. There are people way bigger than me who I think are way smarter than me, and vice versa. So ultimately, if people don't like a piece of content I make, I don't care. Like at the end of the day, I'm not making things that I'm seeing as disrespectful, not intending to disrespect anybody. If anything, I'm trying to usually educate and or entertain, sometimes both at the same time. So it's whatever. It's a part of the process. People will like you, people won't. But what I have noticed is that when people come up to me in person, I've actually never had a negative interaction, ever. Like every time people walk up to me, it's, oh, hey, Matt, oh, great, great to meet you. It was nice. Watched your video. It was super cool. So there's somewhere in the internet, there's somewhere in this void that doesn't actually translate to the real world. And it seems
that
that
the
people are
same
just
logic,
angrier online.
though, that like you would never have went up to Tom Platz and made those comments either?
Again, it's different because that is
we
just
tend to be
entertainment.
non-confrontational in person, right?
I mean, that is just general entertainment. So like I said, it would not be respectful to walk up to someone who's not there for an analysis of their physique or whatever. It would not be respectful to be like, oh, your training sucks. Like, of course not. And for one, I didn't say that. But even if it was like the point of a video, that's not something I would say. If I analyze a clip that someone made from 40 years ago, that's not indicative of them personally. That's not indicative of how I feel about them. Like I said, I'm a big fan of Tom Platz. I'm a big fan of most of the people I talk about. So if I criticize or nitpick or even get into the nuances of something they said, then that's interesting content. If me and Tom Platz sat down and had a long form podcast, I'd probably say, hey, Tom, it was really interesting that you said in your own words, you never went above 30 pounds on dumbbell curls, but then there's videos of you doing 50s, but then you train legs much heavier, but that's because your legs are much stronger in a higher range. I would love to get into that. I think that would be super cool. I don't see these things as a sign of disrespect. I see it as a very large open forum discussion, and that's it.
So for the sake of conversation, let's just say that I completely agree with you and I don't see this as at all disrespectful, right? I would take the approach of what is the purpose of the reason that you make content? Basically, you're making content because you're trying to attract people to your business and grow.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like if you're saying, hey, the intention was this, and I don't really care about the outcome, to me, just purely from a business perspective, I think that's a miss. If I'm talking about it just from say you weren't doing this for business, but you were just doing this because you were just trying to get this message out, I think it's also a miss. I would be auditing like, okay, how can I go about having these conversations without getting such a visceral negative response? Because if I do that, especially like right now, like you're like, hey, I'm talking about this, and the result of that, I don't know, I'm not really on TikTok other than I go there occasionally to just look for things for people that I know really aren't as active on Instagram. So I don't get a good idea of what the overall general reaction is, but on Instagram, I'm more aware. So if I'm saying basically, okay, if I do this type of content, it's resulting in a net negative look for me. What's that doing for my business, right? Is this really helping me? Maybe I reach a few people, but if there was a way that I could change this where I could get, even if it was less of the virality, because it's look, if I can get the same reach and engagement, but literally none of the negative, that would be a net positive, right? Cut out all of the negative views because none of those are helping my business. And it could get just a ratio of more positive, even if it goes down a little bit. I'm like, that's going to help me build my reputation, build my brand, and attract people more, especially if I don't want to isolate myself to only appealing to people that are essentially going to be the opposite cult of the haters, right? Because basically stuff gets very tribal. So right now you have basically people that are anti-science based, and then people that are quote unquote, I don't even like saying the term science based, but in terms of TikTok terms, we talked about the definitions. So I don't think TikTok science based is science based. I think it's science branded is what it is.
Yeah.
Right. But I think what needs to happen from this community, and my suggestion to you would be, it's like, how do I have these interesting conversations where I can talk about things that will get a lot of attention? Like I know people that talk about bodybuilders that are not huge and that they're very successful in the way that they do it because of the way they approach it, and and just their overall messaging and stuff, like they're able to do it in a way where they're able to garnish enough respect and be nuanced enough. And they have 20x the following that you do now because they've gone that approach. And some of them have done it in a very short period of time. And I think that's just because the way they do things, one is, I think critiques need to be very specific and not general, because if you do a general critique of someone, it's just open to too much negative interpretation. So like one suggestion would be like, okay, if I'm going to talk about this, how can I talk about this in the most specific way possible without having it be in any way like a negative on that, and also displaying plenty of humility in the process, right? So for instance, people have asked me on a podcast if I think using my methods that Ronnie Coleman could have gotten bigger. Okay. So two things can exist. One is, I think I know a lot about being able to optimize training and programming, right?
Sure.
I would argue that my knowledge of those topics is better than Ronnie Coleman's was. Okay.
I would agree with you.
In a general stance, that does not translate to, I know what was best for Ronnie Coleman in any way, right? That also doesn't mean that the things that I know would have been enough to make a difference in terms of what Ronnie's doing, because there's certain thresholds. Like you can't just add up. Like I think there's this misconception that you can just add up optimizations and it just keeps leaning to faster. That's not how it works, right? We can't just have all of these things. It's no, what we can do is we can try and optimize, do as many things, and then cool, we can only get so much stimulus in such an interval of time, and then there's probably only so much we can get in the period of time that
Diminishing
we're
returns
training
to a degree.
And so the idea of, could I have gotten a better Ronnie Coleman? Was his elbow flexion training technique really the thing holding him back from getting any bigger biceps? Like at that case, probably not. It probably didn't really matter. Difference was so close to zero that nothing probably could have made a difference at that point in time. And other things probably just made such larger of a significant difference. So that would be my suggestion. And I don't have the exact answer for you, because this is also not a type of content that I go in.
It's a good thought. It's a really good thought. I very much agree with what you're saying completely. A piece of context I'll add to that is that unfortunately and it seems like Instagram does this, YouTube and TikTok not quite as much. With Instagram, what happens is people will decide that they hate you, and it doesn't matter what you do or say, they will find a reason to hate you. Like a guy DM'd me yesterday and he goes, Matt, I'm training with my friend and he hates your guts. And I'm like, okay, cool. And he goes, yeah, he hates your guts, but we're actually using your upper lower split. I downloaded it and we're training together. And I'm like, did you tell him that? And he's like, no, I haven't told him yet, but he hates your guts. And I'm like, it's odd when you kind of hear that, where it's like, wow, someone will actually hate you, like literally hate your guts from a video you make or an opinion you have or whatever. So while I do agree with what you're saying that like, yeah, if you get really nuanced and specific and whatever, you could maybe foster a little bit better of a reaction. But then it's also like, why at times? Like, why should you have to, in a sense, like pigeonhole yourself, or I don't know, like pussyfoot around a certain subject, I guess, if that makes sense. Like, why do we have to restrain ourselves so much to where it's like, just letting everybody know, this has a lot of context. Like, I do agree with the idea of being nuanced and being specific, but it's also like, yeah, you're a very smart guy. I feel like it's important to double down on the fact that, yeah, like I have experience. I have trained a lot of people, you could explain all the things you've done. I feel like there is something to be said about, yeah, like I'm confident in my right to share my beliefs as a person. I have a voice like everybody else does. And if people don't like it, then that's on them, right? So I feel like there's something in
you,
both.
you can approach your content creation of just, I don't care what anybody else thinks, right? So I was speaking like, hey, if you're doing this with the intention of your content is for your business, if your intention is, hey, I want this to be an expression of, I don't give a fuck what anybody else thinks, and I'm going to say what I want to say. Cool. But those are two totally different goals, right?
Different goals.
So,
Yeah.
but I think that the
Value your
main utility of your content is to leverage it for your business. Like me personally, mine is a mix, right? But I also have a business page too, right? I will post things on my personal account that are a little bit more just me that I wouldn't
Yeah.
put on my business account, because I'm like, all right, I know that I'm going to speak in a way where it's going to maybe get a certain reaction, or it's going to be associated with certain people, etc. I don't want this to be representation of the business brand, but it is, hey, this is the way I feel, and I want to do that. And everybody gets to choose that. But the other reason I bring this up is because of this topic of, okay, we do have two very different groups right now. And it's up to you on whether or not you want to leverage that divide, because there's two ways you can, or multiple ways you could approach this. One would be like, okay, the tribalism exists. I'm going to appeal to my tribe as hard as possible and create a ride or die community over here. And then other people can do that on the other side. That's the worst for the industry overall. Okay.
Yeah.
But a lot of people will find individual success doing that. Like, it's cool. You can absolutely get great engagement with that type of content. I do believe that's playing a short-term game though, because these things do trend and the tides can tip into your favor. And all of a sudden it's not that cool to be a part of this tribe anymore or whatever. And we may see that in the quote unquote science-based community right now, because you may not be the person out there saying, hey, just do 2 reps or whatever. But guess what? You're going to be in that bucket for a lot of people just because of the terminology. Yeah. If you want to be a part of, hey, can I actually protect my branding and try and be a positive force in the industry, then maybe I can both improve my business prospects and improve the industry if I can find a way to navigate this stuff. You're not going to win over the people that have already decided that they don't like you for whatever reason that is, or at least the majority of them.
That group is lost. Yeah.
So people tend to be like, okay, once I dislike a person, it's just not super convenient to change that. Cool. But do you want to accumulate more and more of those people over time, or do you want to limit how many of those people you accumulate and maintain as many people that are potential customers, or at least aren't just, don't listen to that dude, he doesn't know what he's talking about, etc. So, and that's totally all of this exists on the other side as well in the same context. I would say more trendy, and there's also a larger entertainment value to the kind of crapping on the science-based people. But in a lot of cases, they're making themselves very easy marks, right? But the problem is that essentially on the other side, they occasionally start stepping too far. For instance, like the topic about RIR. There's nothing wrong with training to 1 RIR, right? But you saw in your tricep video, depending on the context and how that's presented, right? Once there's a stigma, now even something that shouldn't be like that, like we really shouldn't be criticized, can become a target, right? And that's where it's okay. Once you create a certain negative brand or stigma around you, what it does is it opens up people to attacking you for things they shouldn't really be attacking you for, just because it's like, now you're just a target, and so anything you say becomes a thing.
Anything. Then people, once they decide they hate your guts, then it's like fair game. I mean, what you're saying is so true, because it comes down to, our 5,000 views that are good views, are those more valuable than 20,000 bad views? And it's like, I would probably say 5,000 good views are probably more valuable. But then a lot of times that content you're making, people don't seem to think are as interesting. So the way I've been evaluating my content now is almost like striking a nice balance, where we have one video for the day that's maybe either a little controversial or more viral or whatever, then another video that's more, hey, simple, actionable fat loss, whatever it is, simple, actionable muscle growth, positive, whatever. So when you strike a nice balance, I feel like that's almost like what you were saying. You're not muzzling yourself, but you're also moving yourself in the right direction of merging communities and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Keep in mind too, though, that the algorithm does not discriminate between positive and negative. The more content that you make that gets negative reaction, will start showing your content to people that are less likely to like it. So what I can tell you from running a business in this space for a while is there is not a terribly great correlation between social media analytics and customer acquisition, at least not in the realm that I'm in. It's not completely uncorrelated, but definitely not what most people think, okay, cool, if I grow my following, there's going to be a linear correlation to customers and business and whatever. And in reality, like I didn't see a change really from 50,000 to 120 or whatever thousand or in that span. And I can't, if anything, I saw like maybe even a drop off from getting over 100,000 to like the 150,000 mark, which was weird for a while. Okay, things are going up, things are going down, and now they're leveling off. Same thing for the type of content. So if I make like reaction-based content and stuff, gets way more engagement, but it doesn't necessarily drive customers. So even though I find that content interesting and somewhat as like community service, if you will, I have to be careful, one, because it can be very addictive to do that type of content because there's like a larger dopamine reward with that type of content.
It's tempting.
But actually doing boring value-based content is actually really what gets people to sign up for seminars. Not because I stitched a thing and be like, this is wrong. Again, you got to find that balance of like, all right, how do I get people, how do I do something that gets a bunch of eyeballs? So then those people have a better chance of seeing some of my value-based content. But in that instance, that only works if the increased eyeball exposure, the algorithm is saying, hey, it's similar to people like this. But if the algorithm is saying, hey, send this guy's videos to
more people who hate him.
Right?
More people who hate this guy.
That basically that's not. And I've seen a lot of people destroy their algorithm and essentially have made their profile almost essentially useless, even though they have a big following.
Hater magnet, you know? Can I ask you, what do you feel like for you with your content? What was the biggest tipping point for you? Like you said, 50 to 120,000 wasn't like a huge difference. What was the tipping point for you with your content? I guess, I assume you had this business before the internet, right? Like you had this before Instagram and stuff, or no? Or was this online?
So, well, it as the brand N1, like that started in 2018, but I have been doing this for a much longer time, just not under the same brand.
What was the tipping point for you? Like, was it a certain type of content you made, or was it something that you shared that really helped grow it?
So I think like the thing, and this is unfortunately one of the more challenging things to do and actually works against, it was essentially the period where we were the most consistent with providing very simple value-based content. Right now, none of it went super viral per se, but we were consistent. It did good on average, but nothing would ever be spectacular. But doing that consistently created essentially a movement because so many people found utility in it that my following base was an extremely engaged following base in terms of they watched it, but also the content that I make oftentimes, because I tend to try and be specific, it doesn't provoke a lot of questions. Some people will intentionally be vague or do things, or maybe even will intentionally say something wrong because they know that will get engagement. And I haven't seen tactics that are based purely on engagement really move the needle at all, other than the move analytics on Instagram. But basically, it's actually the correlation of more consistent, boring content. But that it's also content that tends to take more work to do. Like in order for me to be like, hey, if it's a post on an exercise thing or whatever, it's like, okay, cool. I got to film an exercise and I got to explain it and put some arrows or whatever. That takes longer than just, okay, I'm just going to go into the green screen thing and film a 60-second reel and throw it up. But for me, that's actually the thing. And I think that sentiment is shared across all of our students that are coaches as well, is basically when they try and either get over complex about things or get too fancy and whatnot, what they end up doing is they end up just investing time and energy in the wrong places, and it doesn't actually convert to client acquisition. But it's hard to resist that pop in the analytics, right? That increase in likes and engagement or whatever, especially because it's instant, right?
That little dopamine hit you get.
So if more people would spend time correlating their bank account to their social media workflow, we would see a very different approach to content than people just looking at the analytics that are provided. And it also depends on what you're doing, because if you're selling something that is very low ticket, you can have kind of a low quality following and still get enough people that will do that. But if you're selling, say, coaching services or whatever, where it's like you need a better quality, like you don't need as many people, but you need a following of people that are, we'll say, higher quality and basically see you as a higher value if they're going to invest in a higher ticket item.
I've actually seen that in application myself, because if I have a bad video, or not a bad video, a negatively tinted video that goes really viral, there will be people that watch it and go, yeah, I like this guy, and they'll buy my ebook. That's like 30 pages. It's $9. So people will buy that. But if I have a video showcasing a client's success or whatever, and it gets 3,000 views or something lower, I actually will probably get more coaching applications from that video that got 3,000 views than something just like we're saying that got 500,000 views. Totally different.
Okay. So let's talk about a couple other posts. Why don't we start with the one about what do the first 10 reps do? Did anybody answer that question to your satisfaction yet?
Not particularly. That was made mostly in reaction to a RunBus video, because this whole thing started with him doing the whole, like, just go for the rep, bro. Like the single arm tricep extension.
One more. Come on. Come on. Come on. Good.
All right. That was probably 0 to 1 RAR.
We're doing a single arm tricep extension, dog. Just go for the extra rep. How fatiguing could a single arm tricep extension be?
So it kind of started that whole chain with him. And a lot of people in the comments were like, oh, are you saying never to do 15 reps? And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying plenty of people could go for higher reps in certain contexts. But generally, when you have people like RunBus that seem to be saying, oh, you know, these kids are just lazy and they don't want to do their 30 rep sets or whatever, it's like, it doesn't seem to have much of a basis. Like, what are the first 25 reps of a 30 rep set doing? I mean, the first 5 or 6 reps of a set are the most important. So why not just cut out a lot of that warm up in a sense that's at the beginning? So,
yeah, just to tip that back towards, so that video that he stitched has 1.4 million views, right? But he has several videos now, I think 3 of them that have popped close to or over 1 million views now. I don't have a single video that's hit 1 million views on my page, for example. I think I have one that's done like 500,000, but it's just because it collaborated with TNF. So
that's cool.
But he has a similar size following to you, despite some of those videos popping off at millions of views. Just goes to show that, okay, having that virality of content doesn't mean that all those people are going to, I think it definitely blew up his following, but it's 30 some thousand or something, I think what it is now. But just in context of, okay, what is that relative to, if I have posts that are millions of views, but I only have 30,000 people following me, it just means that content doesn't necessarily mean that those people want to follow your training programs or whatever. So they might have found something that you said funny or entertaining. No, that's not a knock on RunBus.
No,
I'm just talking about the content in general.
Generally, of course.
My answer to what are the first 10 reps doing would be they're stimulating hypertrophy. That's exactly what they're doing, because we're in the context of a set of 15. I think it's easy to discount the outcome data of, okay, look, if we train in multiple rep ranges, we seem to be getting similar hypertrophy. Is that statement true for everybody, all exercise and whatever? I think no. I think basically your rep range should be very exercise specific or whatnot. For that topic, I'm curious where you lie, because I think the effective reps principle and this whole like, oh, you have to do, there's no point in doing more than this many reps, is just a complete misunderstanding of thinking that the effective reps is this binary thing, and that high threshold motor units only are recruited at the end, that they aren't recruited earlier. It's just like, no, this thing's just on a scale, right? Like, we're just kind of stretching out the stimulus scale. It's a more gradual slope versus it's a steeper slope versus it's more of a plateau. There's evidence that maybe potentially there's actually regional specific benefits to training at different rep ranges, right? There's other adaptations we get in terms of strength and hypertrophy at different, or not strength hypertrophy, but strength and like metabolic adaptations that we get when we're working at different rep ranges or different rest intervals, etc. So I really think right now there's just this viral misapplication of motor unit data, which we know way less than we think we do, the effectiveness theory, which is just a theory which we understand way less than we think we do. And it's just been disseminated in the most absolute limited context with no nuance. And now we have people saying, hey, just do sets of 2 reps.
Yeah. I mean, look, so on a sliding scale, like you said, some people 3 reps might be like very effective for them, and some people maybe 6. Like you said, it is stretching out that scale. So I don't ever want to be seen as having the opinion of you only have to do sets of 5 or whatever. But again, when you have people like RunBus that are starting it going, oh, these kids are just lazy, you know, they're doing sets of 6. And it's like, well, based on what we have available to us, it looks like that's sufficient. And it looks like, yeah, when you isolate a set of 15, you'd say, okay, well, the first 10 reps are being stimulative towards hypertrophy. But when you look at it in the context of your whole workout, it just doesn't seem, based on what we have, super necessary to ever go above 6, 7, 8 reps from what I'm seeing.
Necessary to ever go below 7.
Not neither as well. No, I would not say it's super necessary to go below 7
either. That's the problem. So, yeah. That is the problem with that statement, is there's an implication to it that does not exist.
Again, the way I see it is, had RunBus not sort of built that premise that, you know, kids are lazy, they're not, you know, they're training dumb by training 6 reps or whatever. Had he not built that premise, I would not have made that response. Does that make sense?
Can you Steelman RunBus position for me?
Steelman, like what, summarize it?
Steelman his position on why he's taking that position, right?
When you
why
say Steelman, you mean like explain why he's doing that?
Yeah, like basically it's the opposite of a straw man, right?
Okay. So it seems like for whatever reason, he found that this type of content does really well for him, that like shitting on like kids and people who are smaller than him, which is obvious because, you know, he's enhanced and has probably been training for, seems like a little bit of time at least, and I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years at least. So it seems like his content that has performed well has been just like dunking on like 17-year-olds that are like studying this stuff in high school or for leisure or whatever. So once he's decided that this content has done really well, he's leaned into this sort of side of the aisle, like the bro side of the aisle, where it's like, yeah, just train heavy, lift hard, whatever. I feel like he just leans into that very, very hard without actually capturing the nuance that, like, wait a minute, there are people like younger than me, smaller than me, who have actually acquired a good deal of knowledge, who are taking certain premises and building their training off of that. So I feel like it's just the negative type of content that has performed well for him. So that's why he's just really, really leaned into it.
Okay, that was a straw man, not a steel man. Let me try and do it for you. All right.
Okay, let me see.
The steel man for that type of content is, so you're not liking that reaction, like that content as a reaction to your content. The way I would steel man is, but what was the motivation? Like, how did that type of content even come into existence? And it was only because there was something to react to in that sense, which means we have so many people saying, oh, they have no IQ if you do more than 4 reps. So basically, what you have is we're looking at one action and reaction and not realizing the other steps in the chain. And basically, both sides like to do that. They like to create their own point of origin, right? It's the way that you have a political argument about who are the bad guys at one point in time, and then make your story from there.
For the record, I think that's stupid. Like, if someone does make a video like, oh, if you do more than 4 reps, you know, you're stupid or whatever, I think that is stupid.
I'm glad you say that, because I don't think RunBus's content is going to ultimately lead to a huge correction. I believe some people don't like it. I'm sure you don't like the stuff that's at your expense, but
I don't really care either way.
From my perspective, the crapping on the science-based community thing was an inevitable reaction because of how extreme it had gone. It was like a necessary thing that needed to happen to start actually pulling it back. The only way we actually get to solve the extremes is actually if people like you, who you're a part of that community, you're just not on the fringe edge of it. You could talk about the same thing with politics, right? It's like there's going to be people that are on the extreme and people that are closer to the middle. The only way that we get people out of the extremes is it's not people on opposite extremes are never going to influence each other. It has to be people like you that actually come out and correct the people that are in your own niche. So if now you're going to get accused of grifting, but that's a short-term thing, right? It's a short-term thing. If you're thinking about long-term, okay, what is the actual message that I want to get out there. What do you actually believe on rep ranges? Now, it sounds like you have a slight inclination to think that lower reps might be more favorable,
Yeah.
but how confident are you in that? Like, how good do you think, or how strong do you think the evidence is to actually support that?
And lean towards it, but that could change in 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is. And I do think the number one word that encompasses all of this is application. If you're doing tricep extensions for 4 reps and you go, oh my God, my elbow hurts, that's a very obvious reason not to do 4 reps. So if you do 11 reps on tricep extensions and you feel that that's a lot comfortable, you find it more progressible over time, that's a very valid reason to do 11 reps. I'm somewhat confident based on what we have, based on what we know about motor unit recruitment, that over time, as we get very, very close to failure, there is a higher degree of motor unit recruitment. You're tapping into higher threshold motor units that are harder to tap into at the very beginning of the set. So if I see a set of 5, I'm like, okay, it looks like you cut out a lot of the noise that might be in a set of 20. Am I super, super confident that that will be the only approach I mean, it's not the only approach now, but am I super confident that in 5 years that'll be the best approach? No. But when I take something, you could take a theory, you lean into it a little bit, but you say, hey, an application, there are many different reasons why you might modify this.
So how much have you went down the rabbit hole on this topic?
Pretty deep. I mean, I wouldn't say I could read you a study front to back now, but I have done my digging to the best of my ability. There are people obviously who are a lot smarter than me that know more about this, but basic principles like mechanical tension, motor unit recruitment, digging into it and saying, hey, it looks as if being very close to failure is pretty important based on a body of research. Some of the research is done on untrained subjects. Some of the research is done maybe in too short of a time frame. Some of it's done with too much volume to recover from. So like I said, there are certain limitations, but it looks like for the most part, there's a good consensus on lower rep ranges being slightly favorable.
Okay. So I would disagree. I don't think the mechanistic data that we have tells us enough, right? Especially like we always want to consider outcome data and mechanism. Like when we have outcome data and it doesn't support the mechanistic data, either we're not able to do the outcome studies good enough or we're missing, like sometimes we have a mechanism worked out, but we don't realize that there's tons of mechanisms happening simultaneously. And there are thresholds and bottoms to all of these. A huge mistake people make is they look at a mechanism and think that because this is how this works, it's going to work in this magnitude of fashion. And that's how the total system is going to work. And that's not at all the case. We see this with tons and tons of things, especially in nutritional biochemistry, where it's, oh, we have this mechanism, but oh yeah, a lot of things just work themselves out to where it's, yeah, one mechanism is canceling out another and
things don't always work in isolation.
Right. So I think that there's an assumption that we, especially like with the motor recruitment thing and like the topic of the eccentrics and stuff, like I've dug into this to the extent of where basically it's like I've had to reach out to people that basically this is their PhD. And I'm like, hey, am I interpreting this paper right? And we're at the end and okay, yeah, we're at the end of what we can conclude here. And we can't make these extrapolations with any confidence based off of what's there. So I would say that I think there probably exists a point of diminishing returns, right? I personally, just based off of my observational experience, probably think it's closer into the 15, 20 range than the actual 30 reps. Right. And also we don't have that much nuance in the lower. If we look at actually the comparisons that we have, it's not like we have comparisons all across the board. We have, oh, this study compared like 5 and 30 and this one 7 and 3 and whatever. It's not like we have a nice continuum or a lot of data on that.
Yeah.
And then same thing with the motor unit data, like our ability to measure these things and know what's going on is very, very limited. And a lot of these things, we can't tell the difference between motor recruitment versus rate coding. And both of those things are going to reflect the relative mechanical tension that's happening. And what about the synchronization difference between the concentric and the eccentric? How does that play in terms of the relative twitch tension that's actually happening in the muscles? They're more peak here, but the average is this, like getting into things from like, ugh, this is, I have no idea.
Yeah.
So that's just like from a physiological perspective, I think we know a lot less than what we like to imply. And my suggestion on these topics, if you're going to make a claim that you think this is here as a principal thing, you better be pretty confident in it. It's very hard to establish that or to be that confident anytime the mechanisms and outcome don't work together, because clearly
There's a
right.
disconnect somewhere.
And a
Yeah.
lot of people do what they do is they just point to whichever one disagrees with them at the time. They'll be like,
Mhm.
oh, the study is this subject or whatever, but they'll never apply those same criticisms to like, do you actually know how good we are at measuring hypertrophy or motor unit recruitment? And they don't understand the like EMG has limitations. Okay, how limited do you think we are in terms of measuring individual motor units and actual fiber tension
Yeah.
and stuff? People don't
Yeah.
realize that we haven't completely worked out the muscle contraction, right?
Yeah.
We have the sliding filament theory, which is now like the 3-filament theory, right? Because, oh yeah, we found tighten or whatever, but we still don't know
Mm.
exactly the internal mechanics of the muscle and how they behave in real time. We have models for these things that we try and
Yeah.
get somewhat
Actin,
predictive.
myosin, the cross bridging.
Yeah, but there's a lot that we don't have at that level of nuance, right? We're just looking at things at such a zoomed in level. We're like, what about when all of the other factors are considered? So for
Yeah.
something like the rep range thing, practical should be your guide, right? So for
Yeah.
some exercises, like take a front squat, for example, or something where it's like respiration is a limiter. Doing that for high reps, you're introducing a element of fatigue and restriction that doesn't need to be there if we do lower reps. But for a lot of other things, it's like, can we really make a strong argument that you're going to benefit from lower reps? And then population wise, this generation that is now super focused on doing very low reps, are they actually the population that can really get the expressed benefits of enhanced motor recruitment in that rep range? Or have they actually accumulated the tissue and neurological efficiency to really be effective in that training range? So,
And they even train hard enough. Some people can't
Yep.
even train hard enough to even benefit. No.
right. So me as a coach, if I watch like the video you did on the shoulder press, that's been critiqued a lot. Like when I see that and I just see the way that you're handling that load, to me, I'd be like, okay, right now we're working at an intensity range that your body isn't extremely efficient with yet.
Here we go.
Go ahead.
Before I forget, I just wanted to set. So that was designed for an incline chest to get a degree of shoulder flexion. That machine at the gym I was using was like very janky. So no matter what you do, and I actually used the same machine,
Yeah, I
or
saw
the
it.
same type with TNF. It's very janky. So I'm here trying to get, to the best of my ability, a good level of shoulder flexion and some horizontal adduction. And that's it. So
gonna make my
just setting the
argument
record
for
on
me.
that. So that's what I was
So-
going for upper chest.
You're going to make you basically made part of my argument for me, right? So that machine looks like the handles move individually and super stable, right? Okay. So let's say that you're holding dumbbells, right? Which would have no external stability. Okay.
Yeah.
If you were efficient at that motor pattern for that intensity, I would expect those dumbbells to still move relatively smooth in a coordinated fashion. I wouldn't expect a lot of deviation in internal or external rotation and elbow position, et cetera, right? So I would be like, okay, are we efficient at this motor pattern at this intensity? I would expect them to move smoothly. You have a janky machine, right? Now, you would argue that the handles don't freely move as much as dumbbells, but also because they're fixed, you're probably pushing in different force vectors than a dumbbell when you're balancing it. So it's different. But I would say the fact that it's a janky machine is to me, if we're actually considering application, that's a prime example of when I would not use the lowest rep range and I would err for a higher rep range. Because I guarantee you, even though that machine's janky, if you go back and you did a set of 15 on it, you could probably maintain stability in that machine significantly better.
Agree. I overshot my range a little bit as well. Like, again, we're just there. Again, it's the practical thing of making content. We were at the gym filming and we're like, oh, what's a good video to make? Okay, let's go for this incline chest press I'm going to do. Let's pick a rep range. I'd never even used it because the gym's like an hour away from me. This was at a different gym, but I've even used that machine before. So I'm like, okay, well, what are we going to go with? Well, this weight feels good. So it's not even like I had a previous record of what I did last week or the week before, but I'm not even at my regular gym using a janky machine I've never used before. And I'm trying to just kind of guess like where my range is. Sometimes you're going to overshoot or undershoot or whatever.
Yeah. So here's something that tails back to the old school bodybuilding. How much have you watched you watch Arnold train? It doesn't even have to be that old. Just like you watch Jay Cutler, Ronnie Coleman, whatever, you watch these guys train, look at the amount of control they're exhibiting over the, even if you take a guy like Branch Warren, who was literally a grip it and rip it, which is not the
Yeah.
training style I would recommend, his
Mhm.
relative control over those intensities, it's like, is better. And this is where, when we get into what's the gym IQ, right?
Mhm.
Is part of that is understanding, okay, what is the relative loading that I can use in this exercise where I'm able to do that exercise very proficiently and efficiently, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
especially in people that don't have a lot of years under their belt training, I would think a lot of them are going to benefit from not going so far intense that, okay, now we're seeing a lot of shaking. And I think that's also one of the reasons that people are like appealing to, oh, I have to choose 10,000 things to stabilize me. Stability is an important aspect, but a lot of people don't understand it. A lot of people are adding stability in a way that wouldn't actually improve motor recruitment because all they're doing is giving themselves the ability to bring more muscles in. Simply making an exercise more stable does not necessarily make it more isolated to a particular muscle. So you could actually be having more systemic motor recruitment in an exercise like a fixed handled press than a dumbbell press, because you're
Mhm.
simply able to press in more directions and use your triceps more
Sure.
and things
Sure.
like that. And I think an example we could talk about that's a little bit different would be like the leg extension, for example, right? So he
Mhm.
had a post on using the seat belts and the straps, and some people are going to be like, that's unnecessary, right? And if we steel man that argument, the question is, if you're doing a leg extension, what is the reason that you have to hold on, right? Like, why? Okay. That implies that the torque that you're producing at the knee and then the force of the pad on your shins, that is enough that it would lift your butt up out of the seat. Okay. Now, if you have strong quads relative to your body weight, that
Mhm.
is possible, but it's not as excessive as most people think. So, an example we do at our course is we'll take somebody where they're having a hard time holding down, and all I'll have them do is sit off the back pad, and the
Mhm.
majority of the time, they don't lift themselves up anymore. Okay.
That's cool.
And the reason is because what people are doing with the back pad is they are
Mhm.
hip extending and knee extending at the same time. So they're doing a
Mhm.
hip thrust and a
Uh-huh.
leg extension at the same
Mhm.
time. So if I'm hip extending, well, guess what? I'm going to have to grab onto the handles and hold myself
Sure.
down. And if I'm hip extending and knee extending a lot, I might even put a seat belt on there, right? But what has that allowed me to do in terms of actual motor recruitment? It's allowed me to recruit basically my grip, my arms, my traps, my spinal erectors, my
Mhm.
glutes, right? And so are we actually making this like a better quad exercise by turning it into a hip extension, hip thrust combo?
I'd say that's
Right.
where application comes in, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like you go either way, right?
So, what if you want to talk about utilizing a seatbelt or something like that? Let's say I wanted to make a video on the application of using straps or seatbelt. None of those by themselves are bad if the context was, hey, I'm not pushing back at all. I'm not doing any hip extension action. I just am so strong in my quads relative to my body weight. Especially if you're leaning back and you're getting your body weight further away from the knee lever, that means you got to have really, really strong quads to be lifting you up. So I would go through like, all right, what do I want to happen here? How do I isolate the knee joint? The first thing would be, let's eliminate just not lifting myself up. Okay.
Mhm.
Then practically from there, if I don't do that, do I even need straps, or is holding on
Mhm.
like not that difficult because I'm not lifting myself up that much? Okay. If it is, cool. Then we can
Mhm.
look at like, all right, maybe straps are a convenient thing. But when does the seatbelt become the quote unquote practical necessity? And this is way down the chain. The people that are gravitating towards this and applying it, the reason there's so much pushback is people see it impractical because it's probably unnecessary for those people in training 2 years. Because what are the odds that if you're doing this properly, that you need all of that stability to manage your quads in that scenario that early? If we have these huge bodybuilders with 32-inch thighs that are
Mhm.
able to do this. Now, yes, it is a power to weight ratio thing, but if they were able to do that without having this hip extension type thing happening, what are the odds that somebody that's 1 or 2 years into it? And then sometimes it might be like, okay, the main thing you need to improve is you just need to get your upper body bigger to hold you down, right? No, it's a good joke though. So if we take something like that, this is where I think if we're really being, quote, science-based in our approach, we have to look at one, okay, are we applying these things? If we're talking about doing a good job of messaging to the community, it's when would you need this? And how do you make sure that you're not just putting a Band-Aid on a problem that allows you to make that problem worse? Because if somebody is just hip extending and knee extending and you give them a seatbelt, all you do is give them the ability to basically do a maximal hip while also doing the knee extension. And if your logic is that you are trying to get better motor unit recruitment, you're literally doing
the opposite.
Right.
I agree with all. I mean, I like what you're saying. I think it's very valuable to learn how to execute certain movement patterns properly. I do feel like anecdotally and just personally being there, some people will just benefit from the actual sensation of having something around their grip to be tied in. So I almost feel like we can't overanalyze everything, right? There are certain movements where people do just want to kind of sit down, like bang it out, get it over with. So when we kind of pick our battles of like what movements worth really like diving into in this session, like triceps. For me, example for triceps, you know, I have elbow pain. If I kind of come out here, if I come in here, it feels a little better. So there are certain moments where I like to rework it to where I'm like, wow, this is really worth my energy. When I sit down, I'm like, let me just bang out some leg extension. If I have a seatbelt and I have my bursa grips and I tie in, I'm like, wow, I feel super comfortable. That to me is worth whatever motor unit recruitment trade-off I might be making. But I see why it would be individual.
Yeah, but you're like what you're saying there, that is not the messaging that's being presented in the video when you're talking about the seatbelt, right?
Was there a quote I made specifically that stuck out to you?
It just came off as that this makes the leg extension better. It's not presented that, hey, I just do it like this because it feels comfortable. That's not at all how it's presented.
I understand. I understand.
So, okay. Cool. So I wanted to know we talked a little bit about rep range. Can you kind of summarize what you see with the fatigue thing? Because this seems to be another one of those topics where it's being carried a little too far. There's memes on both sides of the aisle. So where do you fall on the fatigue discussion?
I mean, fatigue in general, look, is important, I feel like, to consider, given that there is only a certain amount of productive work that we can do, at least to a point. And obviously, I'm sort of in the theory that, hey, every set that we do over the course of a section gets slightly less productive. Whatever you do at the beginning of the session, I feel like is going to be more useful for growth than what you do at the end, generally, as motor unit recruitment goes down and you require fatigue throughout the session. You know, fatigue, I don't feel like is feeling tired. I do feel like fatigue is measurable to an extent. That's a decrease in performance, decrease in motor unit recruitment. So I'm not like scared of a fatigue demon or whatever, where I won't do a higher rep set if needed, if I feel like it's more comfortable, or I won't do a second set, or have someone I'm working with maybe do more sets because they have less of an ability to actually push themselves and apply themselves. So some people will train, they call it failure, but then I'm watching their concentric velocity, I'm watching the way the rep is going, and I'm like, I don't know if that's really failure or if you're just calling that failure. So if you're just calling that failure and it's actually 5 RAR, I feel like you might need more sets, and that's not, the fatigue demon's not going to kill you if you do some more sets. I feel like it's important to be balanced. I feel like the more you train, the harder you train, generally the less you should be doing. And the less hard you train and, you know, the further away from failure you are, the less muscle damage you're incurring in the movements, whether it be via novel stimuli or working muscles at an extreme length. I feel like in that case, you could do a little bit more.
What are the things that you consider are more fatiguing that if you were concerned about it, you would limit it? Are you focused more on the rep range? Is it proximity to failure? Are you limiting eccentrics or lengthened movements? You know, all the above?
I feel like a good mix of everything. I feel like, you know, training at length, like very, very extreme length for one. Again, anecdotally, I think it's important too. You know, doing a really deep hack squat with a pause period is going to kind of, you know, take a lot out of you. And I think will be harder to recover from overall. Rep ranges, I think, again, am I going to spontaneously combust if I do a set of 12 on lateral raises? No. But do I want to make every set I do 12 reps or 20 reps, whatever? Probably not. There are certain things I think get very fatiguing at higher reps. I mean, again, hack squat, I think you compare a set of 5 on hack squat versus a set of 20. I don't think it's the same universe sometimes based on the way certain people train and the way some people, especially when it comes down to their respiratory abilities, can't really keep up on certain things. So I feel like it's a good mix of both. I don't think it's important to be super extreme in either way. I think generally cutting out junk volume, junkier reps, cutting those out, junkier eccentrics, just cutting out things that feel a little bit junkier if they're not needed, I think are nice, but I think it's a good mix of everything.
So you're 22 now. You started training when you're
Mhm.
19, right? So
About 19,
almost 4
19 and a
years now,
half.
probably.
Yeah.
Okay, of training. How much experience have you had with training some of these methods that mechanistically you think would be more fatiguing? Have you tried very high rep training or doing things like supersets and drop sets? How much experience have you had with training at longer muscle lengths and stuff like that, or just higher relative volume?
Mhm.
And have you not noticed that the effect on performance and soreness and just overall general
Mhm.
fatigue doesn't drop off significantly after 3 to 4 weeks of training?
I will definitely say that neurological adaptations play a big role as you get adapted to a movement. Obviously, it's going to be less like devastating on your CNS and your ability to kind of recover. I mean, I was just sick for a month, and when I came back to hack squat, obviously it sucked compared to when I was doing it before. But throughout my experience of training, I've tried all these things, supersets, drop sets, whatever you want to call it, working in higher lengths. And with things, if I can't see a convincing argument that it is superior, I will probably not lean towards it. So I'm not super anti supersets. I mean, there was a video Jeff Nippard made a long time ago where he was supersetting like bicep curls and tricep pushdowns. He's like, hey, here's a great way to train if you have 10 minutes. And I'm like, look, if I had 10 minutes, this is fine. However, there's really nothing I'm seeing right now that would make me believe that this is superior to doing, just straight sets back to back. So I've experimented with these things. There are certain things that seem to be obvious benefits, like working the bicep at a more lengthened range seems to be a pretty clear benefit. Certain muscles that are more prone to grow via stretch mediated hypertrophy, hamstrings, quads, whatever, it looks as if training them at a longer length is probably better to a degree. So I'm somewhat sold on that to a degree. But again, it depends on context. I believe it depends on the situation. I'm not entirely sold on one method or another. I think it just depends on, is there evidence right now that me randomly switching to drop sets would be superior to doing straight sets with, about 3 minutes of rest in between? Is there evidence of that being superior? And I'm like, right now, I don't really see that.
Okay. I ask because I think the thing that's often overlooked in this conversation is the adaptation you get to. So the same mechanisms that lead to fatigue are also the mechanisms that lead you to be fatigue resistant, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just posted a thing like the calcium ions is a big mechanism that people talk about, right? And that's one of the mechanisms that we adapt to, right? And so I think a lot of people have looked at the fatigue thing in isolation and think like, okay, if I do a little bit higher reps, it's going to be more fatiguing than lower reps. And I'm like, well, if we take an untrained person or a person that's never done higher reps and has no mitochondrial adaptations, or
Mm-hmm.
their sarcoplasmic reticulum or whatever is not really good at managing the calcium relationship with the rest of the cell, etc., then we will see acutely that fatigue. But if we actually look at what happens over time, we don't see this. And this is probably the biggest reason that a lot of these quote fatigue mechanisms don't end up impacting hypertrophy outcome results in these studies, right? We don't see that like, oh, if you're doing these things, oftentimes the things that we associate with fatigue tend to have a neutral to positive effect, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if we take the lengthen conversation, there is more evidence saying lengthen stuff is either equal or better, despite it should be more fatiguing. If we look at studies on rep range or proximity to failure, we don't see a point where these things seem to have such a negative effect that we're now seeing less hypertrophy, even something with volume, right? We don't see the thing where it's like as volume goes up, that all of a sudden people start losing muscle or dropping off. We do see like this the plateauing effect, like a diminishing of returns, but that's not the same as we're reaching a point of fatigue when I should be getting less hypertrophy. And I think what's missing in most people's logic there is that like, hey, your body adapts to these stressors. And
Sure.
the way we look at programming is we will actually leverage that with periodization, where we will intentionally have people train in a higher rep range or with more density, etc., for a period of time to essentially make them more fatigue resilient. So then we can step down into something that isn't necessarily as fatiguing, but it actually makes us tolerate the overall volume and stuff better. So basically, it's like what I want is my resilience to fatigue to be pushed above what I'm currently trying to train at. I want that little bit.
Yes.
I want that little bit of separation, right? So hopefully that just maxes my ability to recover. Also helps me have a bit of a buffer for life stress, et cetera.
VO2 max, right? Like as you build up your VO2 max, it kind of gets more resistant, you know?
Yep.
Yeah.
And people forget that it's like, hey, mitochondria also fuel performance and recovery, right? Like protein synthesis is not free, right? So and there's something to having both local and systemic conditioning from an energy system standpoint, cellularly, but also from a cardiovascular standpoint, systemically. Like both of those things help performance and recovery. They're going to improve your tolerance to volume and stuff. So if you're on a minimalist approach, none of those things may make a difference. But basically, as soon as you start going north, because you can look at the most efficient thing to do is basically do the least amount of volume. That's the most efficient, right?
Most efficient, yeah.
But most efficient is probably way too slow for the rate of progress. So basically, we have to accept a certain degree of inefficiency towards maximizing the amount of progress that we can get in a certain amount of time, right? So we're going to do more than one set. I would say like most people might do more than two sets, and frequency and volume and all this stuff there are different levers that you can push. If you're going to get 6 sets and you want to do it as 2 sets 3 times a week, or 3 sets 2 times a week, or even 1 set 6 times a week, we know the difference isn't that huge, especially when we look at the limitation and like the 1 versus 2 and stuff or whatever.
Yeah.
A lot of times that's not applicable because they're only looking at one exercise, and people that do the bro split don't just be like, okay, I'm just going to do one exercise for 12 sets today instead of doing 6 and 6. It's like, no, it's like both of those are not representative. And I would imagine that a bro split would not be advantageous if we were comparing the same volume and we only used one exercise across that. I think the context changes when we start talking about different exercises where it's like, all right, maybe we're seeing some regional differences and stuff. I think basically I would argue that on average, and for most people, hitting a muscle group twice a week is better than one. But I would say that gap is different when we're doing it across different exercise selection than the same exercise. Well, I was just curious because that's another thing that I would love to see people push back more on is it's okay, we can understand these things, these fatigue mechanisms, but what we also have to understand is the other part of the story is cool. If you're starting a new program and it's higher reps or it's a little bit more volume or whatnot, you're only going to experience the negative consequences of that period in this small window where you're accumulating those adaptions. And then likely there's going to be no consequence fatigue. There may be even some overall benefits to your training. And also sometimes maybe just for some people, it's just quality of life if they just have better conditioning, right?
Yeah.
And not get hung up on acute fitness. So if I train higher volume today, okay, my fitness will be more impaired tomorrow and the day before that. But fitness is not relative to stimulus or like how much of an effect or how much I'm growing, right? So if we're trying to maximize fitness, then basically what we're just trying to do is like, all right, well, what we're just trying to do is make sure we're always reaching a certain amount of recovery at a certain point to be able to express that performance. That is not the same. And I'm not going to go like full Mike Osriatol mode of where you should be training so hard that your performance decreases. I'm just saying that we can be so focused on trying to maximize performance. And if we look at that in the lens of other sports, it would be like thinking you are peaking for competition all of the time, right? If you look at powerlifting or whatever, right? What they do is they have a back off period to allow fatigue to dissipate and then experience an increase in fitness. But the majority of their training block, they are actually dealing with a little bit of residual fatigue. Like their performance isn't absolutely capped. So I think if you're pursuing a hypertrophy goal, you want to be able to progress, but you shouldn't necessarily be like, hey, I'm at my peak performance every time I go into the gym, because then likely you're erring on the side of doing the least amount, like that you're erring too close to the minimalist amount. So you want to be at that point where it's like, all right, I'm pushing hard and I'm still able to progress. But also if I took
your capacity,
but in the real world, if I took a week off or a couple of extra days off, I would see a bump in performance. So it's like my average performance should be going up, but likely you're probably going to be dealing with always just a tiny bit of residual fatigue. Really, it's probably going to impact your performance less negatively than if you try to do so little that basically you're fully recovered all of the time, right? Which
Yeah.
in some aspects is just unreasonable period. If you're even doing one set to failure, we're like, yeah, okay, you still would have been better having 72 or 96 hours between. That's just the reality of it. But how efficient is it going to be? Yeah, I do one set for body part every 5 days. I'm like, okay, how
Yeah,
much muscle?
it's
Can
just
we
not
reasonably?
enough.
I think people are maximizing the wrong thing sometimes. Like
Yeah.
like the seatbelt example. If you don't need it,
Mhm.
you don't need it, right? And cuffs and things and stuff like that. It's like these things aren't necessarily bad, but you may be like thinking that this is the thing that's going to make the difference, and it's like actually, as much as you might not like to hear it, it might be the extra set, or it might be choosing a rep range that's a little bit more appropriate for your skill in this exercise at this
Yeah.
point in time.
I agree.
All right, well, cool. We're at least on agreement there, right?
No, you got a lot of good points.
Oh, we didn't do the pull down one.
If lats are an extreme weak point for you, then doing 2 direct sets, 1 set of a row and 1 set of a pull down is good anyway. If they're not a huge weak point, I'll say you'll still get some indirect stimulus from a wide grip row like this, and then you also could do 1 set of a pull down.
So your video was if lats are a weak point, and I want you to fill in the context, because I think this is like if you're training 3 times a week, you do 1 set of pull downs and 1 set of rows per day, and you're doing that 3 times a week, so it'd be 6 sets per right?
About Monday, Wednesday, or Monday, Thursday, Sunday, or Monday, Wednesday, rest Thursday, Friday, about 3 times a week, 6 or so sets.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious, how different is that for if you're training same frequency and everything, lats aren't a priority? How much are you changing that total volume?
It depends, because again, I feel like it's how it fits in your program, right? So if lats are a big, obviously there's been a discussion now about whether or not you could actually really bias the different functions of the lat, like the lower lat versus upper lat, whatever. It's been a big discussion. I'm not like super passionate about that either way. I feel like it's probably valuable to do a lat type of row, and it's also probably valuable to do a wide pull down where you're adducting. So I feel like they're both pretty valuable. You're going in for an upper day on a Monday and you're doing like a wide grip row, you're going to get some level of indirect lat involvement. So if I do that for 2 sets, and then I do a lat bias row for 1 set, and then I do a lat pull down for 1 set, that's 2 direct sets of lats and maybe 2 like indirect sets of lats. So however you want to classify that, if lats were like not a huge, if they were like kind of on the back burner for you, maybe just 1 set of a lat row for that session, done 3 times a week, plus the 2 indirect sets from the wide grip row, or 1 set of a pull down done 3 times a week. I feel like that's somewhere in the right ballpark. If that's not a huge priority for you, obviously people can't prioritize everything. I would love to be bigger everywhere. People are like, oh, you seem to grow everywhere. It's like, well, sure, but you can't reasonably bias everything, right? That's kind of how I see it.
Okay. Couple things I'm curious about with just this whole approach to training in general. So let's say you're going to do your set of pull downs, right? And I'm assuming right now you'd say you're going to work in a lower rep range, right? Like
5 to 9, maybe, yeah.
Okay. So what does your warm up look like for that exercise?
Okay, let's say my working weight's 200 pounds. This is just for me personally. What I'd probably do is I'd probably do 50 pounds for 5, maybe I'd do 100 pounds for 4, and then probably kick it and get into my working set, something like that.
So how much time do you think that takes in total? Like starting from your first warm up to the end of your
12 seconds or so between warm ups. So maybe a minute and 15.
It's a lot of calcium buildup, bro.
Calcium ion fatigue. It's going to kill me.
That's one of the things I'm curious about sometimes with the very low volume, high frequency is like for me on an exercise, if I'm going to do something for 4 reps and I'm looking like, all right, so I look at from an efficiency standpoint, okay, if I'm going to do that effort to go and do that set, that commitment to then only do just 1 set of that exercise, to me, that might be super inefficient. And I could see people sometimes applying this, and then their sessions are super long relative to the actual volume of working sets they're doing. And also they're having to do cumulatively way more warm-up sets. So they're doing, you want to talk about like eliminating junk volume, right?
Yeah.
If I'm having to do 50% more warm-up, it is just warm-up, but it's still 50% more time and volume that isn't productive if I'm going to do very low set number per session, Now, granted, if you have multiple exercises, if you do a pull down, that decreases the amount of time you take to warm up for a row because you're more prepared. If you're doing multiple exercises, that remedies a little bit. But I do see the just one set for me leans on the like, that's almost like, it's almost too inefficient in practice, at least. But now that's also going to be really very relative. Like, because I can imagine somebody that is very early in their career, that may not take them that much to warm up because the distance between where they want to start and where they're going to train is very little. But you said you're doing like 50, 100, 150, so 3 in there. And then do you take a bigger rest? But you said 30 seconds, but then do you take a longer rest between your last warm up and your working?
Usually not. I mean, usually it's about 30 seconds to warm up, and I'll get my ballpark. My end is I'll do no more than 3/4 of my working weight for like a rep or two, and then I'm pretty much ready to go. You know, so the whole thing takes about a minute. But it's a super good point. I mean, if you're in there doing 14 different exercises and you have to like meticulously warm up for all 14 of them, I could see why that would frustrate some people and get kind of annoying. So
yeah. So I think that's why one of the reasons on face value why people see that kind of ineffective is they're looking at it from the perspective of like, okay, not only is this very extreme on the volume per session of things, but also it just like practicality wise, it's like, wait, I'm going to go through all that just to do one set, right? So I find that interesting, and just kind of a limitation to prioritizing frequency too much. Like at least in practice, I would say that by far twice a week training is the largest grouping in terms of programming that we find for people that really as many people do a bro-ish split, but really a bro split ends up usually being you're training things at least 1.5 times per week because of overlap. It never really becomes like 1 time per week, at least for most muscle groups, especially if they're using any sort of compounds or whatnot. So the bro split is usually never 1 time per week. It usually is like, you know, it's like a direct higher volume day and then a less direct lower volume day for each body part, or for most body parts, I would say. So I would say on average, like it's 1.5 to 2.5 times is where the majority of our stuff falls, but it never really makes it to the 1 and very few on the 3 time. But also our population tends to be more advanced. So basically full body is really the only thing where we get to people training 3 times per week. And then sometimes maybe like an asymmetrical, like upper lower type thing or whatnot. But I think for most people, what they find from an efficiency standpoint, for them to get the most out of the time they have, like that approach would be time inefficient for our population. Right. So I would say my cutoff, you know, for my personal training is like, if I'm doing low volume per exercise, it's usually, it's like, I've never really done anything below like 2 sets for something, unless what I'm doing is I'm throwing on an exercise that's just like quote unquote, like a finisher type thing or something. Like, so let's say I did some cable lateral raises focusing on the length end. I might throw just like 1 set of dumbbells as like a back off set or something like, so it's the same motion, but it's just the exercise has a different name. That's the only context where I really, you know, am doing that. Right. So how long has that kind of been your approach?
Since, and again, it's weird because I wouldn't say it's 1 set for everything. Most things seem to fall around 2. Something's 1, something's 3. So I've been following that since around October of last year, since like I kind of switched to upper lower, and that was kind of like a nice switch for me.
So when's the last time you did something where you were doing 4 or more sets per session for a
4 or more?
Let's put it this way. Let's say 5 or 6 sets per muscle group per session.
5 or 6 sets. So that would be a higher end, like say 2 sets of an incline press, 2 sets of a flat press, and maybe 2 sets of a fly. Right. We could use that as a sort of reference. I mean, that would probably be when I was on like a chest and buys, legs, back and tries rest split. So probably about a year ago. That would probably be like the higher end of what I'd do there. So, you know, titrating it up a little bit.
Do you anecdotally notice significantly better progress now than then?
I don't know if I'd say significant at like an extreme level, but I definitely feel like I've gotten stronger. My rates of progressive overload seem to be a little bit better. And yeah, my ability to just sort of structure stuff where, say I want to bring up like triceps, right? if I'm doing an upper day and I start the session with just 2 sets of like a unilateral push down type of deal, that's going to feel a lot better than starting a back and triceps day or something, or say even like a traditional push day, right, where I'm doing chest and tries. That's going to feel a lot better than starting a push day, but like, oh, I'm just going to nuke my triceps and do like 6 really hard sets. Then how enthusiastically am I able to train chest after? Probably not as much. So for my needs, I feel like this has helped, but I'm sure someone somewhere enjoys doing that more.
I think one of the reasons people tend to gravitate to either very low or very high frequency, just the simplicity of the programming, right? If everything's like a bro split, what overlap are you worried about? This day is just all of those things, right? You can play around with the order and optimize or whatever.
Sure.
But really, you don't have to worry about what's happening 2 or 3 days later. You don't have to worry about if you're recovered in 48, 72 hours. Like none of those things matter because you get the full week to recover. So it just basically it just is like, all right, well, fatigue in terms of performance ends up not being an issue in the sense of by the time you do the session again. You have the opposite spectrum, which is like, all right, if I do very low volume, then I just really don't ever have to worry about fatigue carrying over to the session because I just never accumulate enough in one to the other. But I think like efficiency happens in the middle, but that's where you actually have to pay the most attention to how you plan things out, right? Where are you putting things, what exercise selection? So how do I minimize overlap within a session or across sessions and order things and whatnot, And I think that's one of the reasons that people that do those things well really start to love things like an upper lower or half body program or whatever, like where they're training everything twice per week. But I know that some people from a coaching perspective or just like a application perspective, if they have done those and the programming hasn't been good, that's one of the reasons they jump out and then they go back to either very low or very high frequency. Is the objection usually is like, we could have solved that through exercise selection, exercise order, right? Or just rearranging these things a little bit rather than having to completely resort back. And so I see that for the bros and also for the extremely like high frequency. Like I think a lot of people that that love like just do 3 times a week full body is because it just is what it is. You don't really have that many options. Is like you don't have to decide what days you train what, because guess what, you just train them all every day, right? So I think the mental load is a big reason that people get appealed to those. And then also sometimes it's easier to program bad, I'd say 4 times a week, training everything twice a week. It's easier to screw that up because you are trying to just compact a little bit more, right?
Much higher barrier to entry to that kind of programming.
Cool, dude. This was a fun conversation. The last thing I want to close on is just is there anything from today that like is making you think differently on how you're going to approach your content, or is there anything you just want to say in regards to what's been going on with you and your content and the reactions to it, etc.? How do we move forward and make things better?
Move the needle. Well, I'd say this. Look, if everybody was like you, we probably would not have any problems. I very much enjoyed talking to you, and it was very cool to hear someone who brings interesting insights and makes me think about stuff and go, hey, you know what? Am I able to defend this or this idea in a long form style? And it's very valuable. So that's an important part of the conversation. I don't think a lot of people are willing to have that. I do think short form content, just in its inherent nature, limits people's ability to communicate well, because it does take an incredibly small fragment with zero context around it at all, and kind of forces people into like badgering kind of battles that probably would be solved in like a 10-minute discussion. That's why you almost never end up arguing with people at the gym about like how they train. Because ultimately, if someone walks up to me and says, oh, hey, I do 10 sets of 10 on this, more than likely the reaction from me would be, oh, cool, that works for you, nice. Like ultimately, for the most part, people are nicer in person. They're more apt to listen to things. So yeah, I feel like ultimately Instagram and just the internet in general does bring out the worst in people. I also do feel like it is valuable to double down on your principles. If you're not being a bad person, you're not being malicious, you're not seeking to harm people or degrade people, whatever, you should in a sense be able to speak your piece, own up and defend it to the best of your ability. And I also think it's important to be humble and try to learn from people and talk to a whole variety of people and not sort of marry a camp of thought or an ideology or whatever.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you give us a like, subscribe, and leave us a review, and we will see you on the next episode of the N1 Experience.